Protests are continuing to escalate at sites across Jakarta after a police vehicle hit and killed a rideshare driver during demonstrations. It follows anti-government protests that began earlier this week, sparked by a lack of jobs, the cost of living and a new monthly housing allowance for lawmakers. That's 10 times the city's minimum wage.
Well, the anger comes alongside the government's austerity measures that have seen cuts to education, health and public works. Elizabeth Kramer is co-host of the Talking Indonesia podcast. She says the implementation of the allowance is tone deaf when looking at Indonesia's cost of living issues.
The housing allowance that you're referring to was announced by Indonesian Parliament last week, and it was set at 50 million rupiah per month, which is around 4,700 Australian dollars. And I think if you look at the housing allowance itself, it's relatively uncontentious because, like in Australia, a lot of politicians in Indonesia also have to move to the capital in order to take up their positions. But where things have become contentious is the actual amount of that allowance. So at $4,700 a month, which I think is pretty generous even by Australian standards. But if you compare that to Indonesian standards, where the minimum monthly wage in Jakarta is actually 500 Australian dollars, this amount felt highly inappropriate to many people in Indonesia. And what this did was actually lead to further discussions about exactly how much politicians are getting paid. And some politicians came out trying to be transparent and said that their take-home pay was around $9,400 a month. But really, this didn't help them at all because it's still so much higher than what your average Indonesian is earning. And so I think what you see in the protests is actually a really sharp reaction to this sense of inequality that people have seen through that particular announcement and other things that have happened in the government. And questions about whether politicians are actually genuinely representing the interests of the people that they're supposed to be representing, or are they just there for their own self-interest.